Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome to Asylums Uncovered, where we discuss the influence and impact of state hospitals on American history and the void left in their absence. We've all heard the story of the wicked stepmother, showering her own children with love and affection while making her stepchildren's lives unbearable, punishing and ostracizing them for no clear reason. But for one 12-year-old boy living in California's Bay Area in 1960, this wasn't a fairy tale where chores were assigned or a trip to the ball was forbidden. Instead, his stepmother turned his own father against him, lied to have him institutionalized, and forced him to have a transorbital lobotomy. Left to live the rest of his life not only wondering what exactly happened to him, but why. This is a story of Howard Dully. Imagine growing up with loving parents and a normal family until one day it's all ripped away, being thrust into chaos. And that's exactly what happened to Howard Dully, and he recounts all of this in his book, My Lobotomy. Today, the idea of forcing a 12-year-old to undergo this procedure would seem unfathomable. So you might be asking, how did this happen? What parents in their right mind would ever allow that? In Howard's case, it's important to understand his childhood of how he got there and the aftermath of the operation. Born November 30th, 1948 in Oakland, California to parents Rodney and June, Howard's early childhood was a happy one. He was the apple of his mother's eye, and he recalls her doting on him and just all around being incredibly affectionate and loving. June and Rodney had very different upbringings. She was from a wealthy family and he was not. Despite being in love and having a happy marriage, there were cracks, mostly between the two families. There was always tension that Rodney was never good enough for her, despite the fact that he was ambitious, hardworking, and held a steady job as an elementary teacher. After Howard, they had two more sons, Brian and Bruce. Unfortunately, Bruce was born with serious brain damage that gave a bleak prognosis. And if he would survive, he would require around-the-clock care. Shortly after Bruce's birth, June passed away from colon cancer at the young age of 39. Howard was only 4 years old when his mother died. And this is where things start to fall apart. At just 27 years old, Rodney became a widower overnight. Suddenly, he was left to raise his sons on his own while grieving the loss of his wife. To make matters worse, June's family tried to take Howard and his younger brother Brian out of Rodney's care. Bruce, the youngest, was sent to live with a full-time caretaker because of his severe brain damage. And after that, Bruce was rarely talked about. It's hard to imagine the pressure Rodney must have been under. He had just lost the love of his life. He was young, grieving, raising two small kids, worrying about a third who might not survive, dealing with in-laws who wanted custody of his children, and he didn't have much money to fall back on. This would be a lot for anyone to carry. Because Rodney was a school teacher in a wealthy neighborhood, the locals stepped in to help after June's death, inviting the family over for dinner, doing laundry, offering to help babysit Howard and Brian, just really anything anyone could do to help. One woman in particular took special interest. Her name was Shirley Lucille Hardin, but most people called her Lou. June and Lou could not have been any more opposite. June was very beautiful, feminine, and was always dressed up and put together. But Lou, on the other hand, was very plain. She hardly ever wore makeup and was always dressed like she was about to go work in the yard. She had a very unstable childhood. Her mother was only 19 when she had her, so she was primarily raised by her grandmother. Lou had previously been married and had two sons, but she wasn't a great mom herself. She didn't have that loving, motherly instinct, which is not surprising considering she didn't have a great role model. Howard doesn't recall Lou ever doing their laundry or babysitting him. In his memory, she simply wasn't there one day and then suddenly she was. Rodney must have felt some kind of pull towards her. Maybe it was they were both single parents raising two boys, or maybe he was trying to fill a void and he didn't want to be alone. Whatever the reason, they quickly became engaged. And before long, Rodney, Howard, Brian, Lou, and her two sons were all living together in a small two-bedroom house. As part of her divorce settlement, Lou kept her home in the upscale neighborhood of Los Altos. That arrangement created a complicated dynamic between her and Rodney. In the 1950s, cultural expectations typically cast the man as the primary breadwinner, while women were expected to stay home. On Rodney's income alone, they would have never been able to afford that house. And as a result, he began to feel inadequate and took on 4 jobs in addition to joining the National Guard. Needless to say, he was rarely home, and when he was either asleep or too exhausted to give the kids much attention. With Rodney gone most of the time, Lou was left to manage the household entirely on her own with little to no oversight, and to say that she ran a tight ship would be an understatement. Lou seemed to single Howard out, making his life miserable whenever she could. He wasn't a bad kid. I mean, did he act up occasionally? Sure. But what child doesn't? And his idea of misbehaving was hiding behind a door to jump out and scare someone. Lou would scream at him, smack him on the head, make him eat dinner by himself, and forbid him from watching TV with his brothers. One year, when his younger brother Brian had a birthday party, Lou and Rodney went all out, even arranging pony rides for all of the neighborhood kids. Howard was told he wasn't invited and wasn't allowed to go outside and see the horses. Imagine being that age and being forced to sit inside alone while your brother and all of his friends laughed and celebrated. Lou would often lie about Howard's behavior and say, "I'm telling your father when he gets home," and Rodney never bothered to ask for Howard's side of the story, likely too exhausted or unwilling to sort through it between his 4 jobs, preferring to just punish and move on. As a result, Howard spent his days consumed with anxiety, waiting for his father to walk through the door, knowing Lou would exaggerate or fabricate something, and he'd end up getting spanked. She called him names like moron and idiot, and truthfully, Rodney offered little comfort or protection. Lou subjected him to relentless emotional, psychological, and physical abuse. She hated Howard. All he wanted was for Lou to love him, accept him, and be proud of him. He even called her mom. So her rejection was incredibly painful. And this made me so sad. Howard said he never remembers being hugged or loved by Lou or his dad. The only physical touch he remembers was being spanked. Lou wasn't affectionate to anyone, not her own boys, not Rodney. She was just particularly diabolical towards Howard for some reason. The other boys had never got in trouble, or at least never got punished. And Howard couldn't understand what he did to make his stepmom hate him so much. And think about what this does to the psychology of a child, their development, and their self-worth. As Howard got older, he grew into a tall, large kid, and eventually Lou's physical abuse didn't hurt him anymore. One time he stood up to her, and it clearly shook her. It was almost as if she suddenly realized that he wasn't a little boy that she could overpower forever. After that, Rodney handled most of the spanking, and Lou started looking for other ways to punish him. He started getting in trouble at school by not listening. He didn't like being told what to do, but when it came to subjects he cared about, he did really well, earning A's and B's. He also got into some minor trouble like stealing a yo-yo from a convenience store or taking change from the newspaper machines. He wasn't a bad kid, he was just acting out, probably looking for attention. But Lou was convinced there was something deeply wrong with him. And this is just a wild assumption to make considering how Howard was treated and the fact that neither Lou nor Rodney ever sat down to try and talk to him to figure out how he was feeling or what was going on with him. First, Howard never really processed the loss of his mother. Then he was thrown into this Brady Bunch family and forced to make it work with a stepmother that hated him and a father that was never around. Starting in the spring of 1960, Lou was taking 11-year-old Howard to meet with different psychiatrists, determined to find something wrong with him. But to her surprise, these doctors said that his behavior was normal, and most of them even said she was the problem. But a narcissist like Lou wasn't going to accept that answer, so she kept searching and eventually was referred to Dr. Walter Freeman. And I'm not going to go into super detail about Freeman here in this episode. If you do want to learn more about him or the lobotomy, I did a 2-part episode called The Man and the Medicine, if you would like to check that out. On October 5th, 1960, Lou had her first meeting with Freeman. The notes about Howard make him sound like he was an absolute terror. And if you know anything about Freeman, you know he was meticulous. He documented everything in detail, and the files he left behind are extensive. Howard's file alone ran more than 30 pages. Reading through these notes, it's striking to see how Lou portrayed Howard as deeply troubled and dangerous. Based on her account, Freeman concluded that Howard had childhood schizophrenia. Interestingly, Rodney objected to Lou meeting with Freeman and thought that there was nothing wrong with Howard to that extent, but for whatever reason, she was able to continue to move forward with her plan. After his initial meeting with Lou, Freeman interviewed others who knew Howard, and depending on who he talked to, the feedback varied. Finally, on October 26th, Howard met Freeman himself, and he described feeling at ease. Freeman was warm, friendly, he smiled a lot, and was impeccably dressed. Most importantly, he listened to Howard. For perhaps the first time, Howard truly felt heard and was immediately drawn to Freeman. The two met a few more times over the next few weeks, and the conversation seemed normal, even to the point that Freeman wanted to take Howard hiking. As you can imagine, this made Lou incredibly angry. She met with Freeman again in November and said things with Howard were getting worse, which of course was a lie. She said she had to keep Howard away from the other boys and the family dog because he's so dangerous that she's worried something's gonna happen. So what does Freeman suggest? He suggests that Howard should be admitted to a children's ward. And this is where it's unclear to me how Freeman went from inviting this kid on a hike to now suggesting that he be institutionalized. He even went further to tell Lou that traditional psychotherapy wouldn't work because he thought Howard was a schizophrenic, and the only cure that would truly fix him was a transorbital lobotomy. This solution was proposed by Freeman in under 2 months after he had only met Lou and Howard 4 times each. So, November 30th, on Howard's 12th birthday, instead of having a party and celebrating him, Lou spent the evening trying to convince Rodney that Howard needed a lobotomy. And 2 days later, it was officially decided. And it's also said that Rodney made the comment that he felt like God when he approved for Freeman to do the procedure. Which again, another point of confusion for me is how does his dad go from saying he doesn't really believe that there's anything wrong with Howard to now just so easily signing away for him to have a lobotomy? Was Lou that convincing? Was Freeman that convincing? Was he so tired and just over the situation that this seemed like the easy answer? It truly is baffling to me. Thursday, December 15th, 1960, Howard was admitted as a patient to the Doctors General Hospital in San Jose. No one told him he was going in for a lobotomy. He just thought he was going in for some tests, and honestly, he didn't mind because he got to miss school, which was exciting. Doctors ran some initial blood work and x-rays, all of which came back normal. Howard was allowed to watch TV, received attention from the nurses, and eventually drifted off to sleep. What he didn't know was that a lobotomy had already been scheduled for the next day. The tests he had undergone weren't routine evaluations. They had been ordered by Freeman as part of the preoperative preparation. On the day of the surgery, Freeman used electroshock to render Howard unconscious, a method he frequently relied on instead of traditional anesthesia. He then inserted the orbitoclast into Howard's eye sockets and tapped it with a hammer to sever the neural pathways. As was his routine practice, Freeman paused during the procedure to take photographs documenting the operation in progress. The entire lobotomy was completed in just 7 minutes. Now, I also want to call out here quickly and remind everyone that Freeman wasn't a neurosurgeon. He was a neurologist, but he was never formally trained or licensed to do surgery. And side note, this is a pet peeve of mine when people talk about Freeman and they reference him as a neurosurgeon. He was not. That is factually incorrect. After the procedure, Howard had no real understanding of what had been done to him. In the immediate aftermath, he experienced what were considered the typical side effects: fever, confusion, some memory loss, and badly bruised, swollen eyes, but nothing that was labeled a major complication at the time. About a month later, he met with Freeman, who explained the surgery to him, and reports say Howard didn't show much of a reaction. But it's hard to imagine how any 12-year-old could fully grasp the magnitude of having undergone such a procedure. So was everything great in the Dully home now that Howard was forced to have a lobotomy? Not at all. Lou still resented him and remained determined to have him out of the house. In the spring of 1961, she found the McGrawls, a family who operated a home for children. Howard lived there for several months, and by most accounts, he did well. He enjoyed his time there, and there were no significant issues. But the arrangement was expensive, and there was also Rodney's pride to consider. He struggled with the idea that someone else might be better suited to raise his son than he was. Which, my guy, you just lobotomized this child. He's finally somewhere that he enjoys and he's thriving, and you just can't leave him alone because of your pride? So of course, Lou and Rodney made a rational decision and tried to get Howard placed at Napa State Hospital. Freeman even wrote a letter to the superintendent on their behalf saying Howard was schizophrenic and had a transorbital lobotomy. And I just have to say, on top of Freeman not being a neurosurgeon, he also wasn't a board-certified psychiatrist. So the fact that he was diagnosing anyone with anything was absolutely wild. Napa's superintendent responded by asking the family to bring Howard in for an evaluation, and after assessing him, the staff concluded that he did not meet the criteria for institutionalization. The report stated plainly, "We did not find him psychotic. He is not suitable for hospitalization." It's hard to imagine that conclusion sat well with Lou. And now we're in this pickle of what to do with Howard. Lou and Rodney couldn't afford to keep him at the McGrawls, where he was clearly thriving, and Napa had refused to admit him. So the solution was to declare Howard a dependent child, a designation typically reserved for kids who are abused, neglected, or otherwise without a safe living environment. This classification made him eligible for government assistance, which allowed the McGrawls to continue caring for him without the Dullys footing the bill. And you might think this would have been a good resolution and that things would settle down, but you would be wrong. Rodney began complaining that Mrs. McGraw was overly religious and didn't allow him much access to Howard, which frustrated him. By the time school was about to start that September, Rodney wanted Howard to return home. Lou, however, refused and threatened that if Howard came back, she would move out. During all of this, Howard was still seeing Freeman periodically, and even he's reporting that Howard is thriving under the McGraw's care and recommends against him moving back home. Once again, Lou and Rodney made a great decision. Howard would leave the McGrawls and move in with his uncle Gene and his family across town in San Jose. By June 1962, Gene's wife was growing tired of Howard and he is sent back home to Lou and Rodney. Later that year, Howard gets expelled from school and it's just all around not a great situation. Lou gets sick with cervical cancer and has a hysterectomy. And while she's recovering at home, things were the same. She is complaining and lying about Howard. Rodney is barely giving him any time or fatherly love. In fact, he's pretty nasty and critical of Howard. Unsurprisingly, Lou and Rodney were looking for another place to send him, and things between the couple are tense. Lou wants Howard gone, and Rodney is convinced he can fix him essentially by beating him. But Howard's a big kid, and he could give his dad a run for his money. In February 1963, he's 14 and 6 feet tall. He's still seeing Freeman periodically, and it's noted at this time that Rodney was trying to have Howard admitted to Agnew State Hospital for a 10-day evaluation period. Opened in 1889, Agnew's was known as the Great Asylum for the Insane, built following the Kirkbride Plan. Located in Santa Clara, during the 1906 earthquake, over 100 patients were killed and the original building crumbled. The hospital was rebuilt in the cottage plan and operated until 2009. While Lou and Rodney were arranging Howard's admission, they had him reclassified from a dependent child to a ward of the state. For context, becoming a ward of the state usually meant that parents completely relinquished custody, often because home life was deemed unmanageable. Being a dependent child, on the other hand, was typically reserved for situations of abuse, neglect, and was intended to protect the child. At least that's how the court saw it. Before Howard was committed to Agnew's, Rodney and Lou first had him placed in juvenile hall. So just to recap at this point, Howard was mentally and physically abused by his stepmother, forced to have a lobotomy, thrown out of his own home and bounced around place to place, was attempted to be committed at Napa State Hospital, was declared a dependent child and then a ward of the state, and now has been admitted to juvenile hall with attempts to get him placed at Agnew's. While in juvie, he was evaluated by a psychiatrist whose opinion was much different than Freeman's. The doctor recommended Howard be removed from the home, noting that his stepmother seemed determined to destroy him. And for the first time, the focus was on Lou rather than Howard, echoing the opinions of those original psychiatrists who had seen him when Lou first began her campaign against him. Now we're in this pickle again. Juvie couldn't keep Howard because he hadn't committed any official crimes. Napa wouldn't admit him, Rodney wouldn't allow him to stay at the McGrawls, and he couldn't go home. So it was decided he would be sent to Agnew State Hospital at 14 years old. This had to be terrifying. Imagine being that young and being sent there. Howard remembers being the only kid in the entire facility. After the initial observation period, the staff told Howard that there was nothing wrong with him and he didn't have to be there. There was just no place else for him to go. Being told this and not knowing if you ever get out would be enough to actually make you go crazy. Howard was at Agnew's for about a year, where his dad only visited twice a month. And then randomly one day, they told him he was leaving and going to a place called Rancho Linda. The Rancho Linda School was a private institution that was designed to meet the special education requirements of mentally and emotionally handicapped children and adolescents. Sounds very much like a state school. It was minimum security facility and it was under 24-hour surveillance. Howard actually liked it there and thought it was a cakewalk compared to Agnew's. Some of the counselors didn't think Howard belonged there and didn't understand why he was. This was a school for mentally and physically handicapped children, and Howard just didn't fit that bill. In March 1966, a headline broke that there was a sex scandal at the school from some of the boys sneaking into the girls' dorms. This was a massive issue. The school gave up its license later that month, and almost all of the students were transferred out to other institutions. Howard is transferred back to juvie, but they couldn't keep him there because he didn't commit any crimes. Because he's almost 18, he is placed in a halfway house in San Jose. But the problem was, he didn't know how to live independently. He didn't have a high school diploma, he never had a job, he didn't even know how to balance a checkbook. How was he ever going to survive? From there, things went downhill and Howard once again bounces around place to place. He's caught writing bad checks, which is a felony, but instead of going to jail, he goes back to Agnew's for 2 years and then to another halfway house once he's released. It seems every time he starts running into trouble, he's forgiven for being the kid with the lobotomy. Now around 21 years old, he's asked to leave that halfway house and begins drinking heavily. Remember, he's never been taught how to be a productive member of society. Howard spent years in and out of asylums, jail, and halfway houses. He was homeless, on drugs, and an alcoholic. Eventually, Howard did go on to get clean, get married, had a child, became a bus driver, and even went back to earn his degree. And through all this, he always wondered in the back of his mind what was wrong with him. No one ever really talked about his lobotomy, so he was left with a lot of questions. In 1998, at 50 years old, Howard suffered a heart attack and had this realization that he needed to find answers. By this time, Freeman had died, Lou passed away, and his father Rodney was in poor health. Anyone who could provide those answers would soon all be gone. Howard started researching Freeman online, and in the early 2000s, he met up with a couple NPR journalists who were doing a broadcast on the lobotomy. Together, they were able to get access to all of Freeman's archives from George Washington University. As I mentioned earlier in the episode, Freeman was a meticulous record keeper, so his files are pretty extraordinary, and after he passed, they were all donated to GWU. Howard was the first former patient who had requested to see the records, and soon he was handed a file with his name on it. For the first time, Howard was going to have the answers he had so desperately been seeking. Can you imagine how overwhelming it was to see the photos and records of himself? He was also able to see what Lou had been saying about him all those years, all her lies. NPR goes on to release My Lobotomy, a 22-minute broadcast about Howard and the procedure in 2005. 2 years later, Howard released his book with the same title. Unfortunately, Howard passed away in February of 2025, but his story will live on, and I think it's an important one that needs to be shared. You can purchase his book on Amazon. If you haven't read it, I highly, highly recommend it. All right, everyone, that's it for me today. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time.